After listening to that, you are already in possession of a key to the mind and character of Alfred Cortot, the poet of the piano. Or so you may think. Certainly there are few pianists who play Schumann as freely as that today, with unsynchronized left and right hands, and such broad rubato. And you would therefore be right in thinking of him as a romantic pianist. He admitted the description, and was not ashamed of it. But the term romantic is a very loose one, and if that was all Cortot had to recommend him, he would have little claim on our attention. The truth is, he had much more. So much more, it's hard to know where to start. The German writer, Stefan Zweig, began a biography of Cortot, but soon gave up because he was swamped with material, and because the more he found out about his subject, the less he understood him. He was not alone in feeling this.
I can say it was very difficult to know him, because he was just a little introverted and very mysterious, you know. And he changed his mind.
Magda Taliaferro, who entered Cortot's piano class at the Paris Conservatoire in 1907, and who, she told me, knew Cortot really no better after 50 years of friendship. He changed his mind, and sometimes, his critics might say, in the middle of putting his fingers down on the keyboard. Cortot's mistakes were famous, and, as we shall hear, there are many explanations offered for his fallibility. But as I see it, they are part of a much larger question, which Cortot poses with unusual sharpness, the question of the relationship between interpreter and composer. In 1937, he recorded Debussy's two song cycles called Fête Galante with Maggie Tate, and he had this to say about one of the songs.
Je voudrais en passant signaler un détail d'exécution qui, dans l'accompagnement de l'une des pièces des Fêtes Galantes, inspirée par un texte de Verlaine, et
I'd like to mention in passing a detail in the accompaniment to one of Debussy's Fête Galante settings of Verlaine, which aroused some interest when we recorded it. With the agreement of my distinguished partner Maggie Tate, for the song Le Faune, I put a piece of paper between the hammers and the strings in the lower register of the piano, in order to bring out more clearly the suggestion in the poem of an imaginary drum, and so accentuating, with, I hope, something of Verlaine's discretion, the characteristically evocative outlines of the poem.
Vibratoire qui se pouvait d'en accuser, avec toute la discrétion souhaitée par son auteur, le caractéristique relief évocateur.
Is that justified? It's a matter of taste, but again, I can't imagine any pianist today having the nerve to do it. Just as interesting as the prepared piano is Cortot's voice. It was often said Cortot could have been an actor. Indeed, in his master classes he was an actor. And his vocal delivery is really a kind of singing. The voice itself deep and sonorous, but embellished every now and then with high floating vowels. If he'd been only a pianist, the voice would hardly have mattered. But Cortot was also a teacher, an organizer, a persuader, you might almost say a preacher. And that beautiful voice was not without its influence in ensuring that 9 times out of 10, what Cortot wanted, Cortot got. Perhaps a little biography at this point might be a help in coming to terms with this complex man. He was born in Switzerland in 1877. His father was French, a supervisor on the railways. His mother was of Swiss peasant stock. There was a brother, Oscar, who was 20 when Alfred was born, and 2 sisters, Leah and Annette, who were 14 and 12. Cortot claimed later that he showed no particular aptitude for music. His parents, for some reason, decided that he was going to be a musician, and so when he was 5, the whole family moved to the nearest cultural centre, Geneva. Leah taught him the piano, Annette taught him theory, and for the next 10 years, Alfred did not go anywhere without the 2 dragons guarding their little treasure. From Geneva, the next stop was Paris. At the age of 10, Colter was accepted into the preparatory piano class at the Conservatoire under Émile Decombe, who had had lessons from Chopin. And after Decombe, he studied under Louis Diemer, a dry, precise pianist whose style cannot ever have been a model for Cocteau. Nonetheless, Cocteau prospered under his tutelage, and in the summer of 1896, not yet 19, he won his Premier Prix, playing Chopin's 4th Ballade. Plenty of colour, noted the Conservatoire director Théodore Dubois, and plenty of authority. Mercure, a remarkable artist. Cocteau was always complaining that nature hadn't given him pianist's hands. Nina Walker was a pupil of his in the 50s, and she remembers being surprised by them.
They were very long and narrow, and the thumb was very close to the hand. Usually with a pianist, like Rachmaninoff's hands, the thumb is open. What I call open, you have this big gap so you can easily stretch a pencil. But with him, he'd had to work around them. Probably this is why he had the loose wrist, because he had to accommodate the hand much more. But the hands seemed enormous by comparison with this tiny body and this very still body.
Vlado Perlmutter, who was a pupil of Cocteau's around the end of the First World War, testifies to the variety in his teacher's technique.
It will interest you, perhaps. He kept his hand not exactly as he used to keep it when he gave us a lesson. You see, instead of playing with the wrist high, you see, or very low, he played sometimes very low with the finger articulating very much. You see, sometimes he played no articulations. He didn't play exactly the same each time, you see, even technically.
Once again, Cocteau changing his mind. For most pianists, a first prize at the Conservatoire was both the beginning and the end of their career. It ensured a lifetime of teaching in Paris and a lifetime of respect. But as luck would have it, Cortot almost at once underwent an experience that revolutionized his view of music. He was invited in the summer of 1896 to Bayreuth, where they were producing The Ring for the first time since its premiere 20 years before. The pianist Angus Morrison makes an interesting suggestion about the effect of this experience on Cortot's playing.
I think with all pianists that you've heard, great pianists, certain forms stand out. The performance I remember of Cortot was not Chopin, not Debussy, but the Liszt Sonata, which he played in a way that I've never heard anybody else play it. Wrong notes and all. No, but Cortot was a pianist who varied more from day to day than I think anybody I've ever heard. And sometimes the inaccuracies were distracting. But when he was really on form, they were not exceptional. And they were part of this enormous grasp of a work as a whole. The Liszt Sonata seemed so gigantic. And I have a feeling that it really was the result of the fact that he, as a young man, used to go to Bayreuth as a répétiteur. And his knowledge of Wagner, I always have a feeling, was what made him play the Liszt Sonata so wonderfully. The feeling of making this big work not seem long and drawn out. Thinking in the Wagnerian proportions.
The combination of awkwardly built hands, a changeable temperament, and a dedication to the overall view of the work at the expense of detail, this combination does much to explain why there have always been people to criticize his playing. But did Cortot owe anything to the French school of pianism which surrounded him? The critic Arthur Aueret, who has been writing music articles in the French press for the last 60 years, remembers the occasion in the late 20s, when Cortot and Wanda Landowska played the Mozart D major sonata for 2 pianos.
Je pense qu'ils ont répété, mais lors de l'exécution, nous avons tous été frappés par la différence de style entre les deux artistes. Wanda Landowska, qui a surtout interprété la musique des XVIIe et XVIIIe siècles, avait un style...
They did actually rehearse, I think, but when it came to the performance, we were all struck by the differences of style between the two artists. Landowska was a specialist in the 17th and 18th centuries, her playing very precise, very ordered, with an absolute regularity of rhythm that did have some freedom in it. Metrical rubato, if you like. Cortot, on the other hand, was a romantic specialist, with all that implies. Well, in the Mozart Duet Sonata, there are lots of places where one piano takes up a phrase where the others left off, and it was quite extraordinary hearing Cortot and Landowska doing this in totally different styles. Landowska absolutely clean and precise, while Cortot had a sort of freedom, a romantic expansiveness and elegance. It really was a strange contrast to Landowska's style, which was that of the harpsichordist she was.
Une sorte d'expansion romantique, une sorte d'éloquence qui contrastait étrangement avec le style de la classiciste.
Cortot's style was also in complete contrast with that of his teacher Diemer, of Saint-Saëns, of Fauré, of Marguerite Long. According to Cortot himself, his model was a pianist now almost forgotten outside France, Edouard Whistler, 4 years Cortot's senior. It was Whistler, playing the Mendelssohn Variation Sérieuse, that opened his eyes. Suddenly I felt the music enter into me, not the notes of the music, but the aura of it, with its power to illuminate, to transmit the incommunicable. This experience lay at the root of his attitude to music from then on, as expressed in sayings like, "Music should be dangerously and magnificently contagious," or "Personal feeling is more important than history." Or, speaking of Beethoven, his works belong to the category about which we must not reason too much. Cortot clearly made up his mind to show the French the meaning of Beethoven, and it was by performances of the concertos in the late 90s that he made his early reputation, and not just in France, but in Germany as well. He also appeared as a conductor and organizer of orchestral and choral concerts, and of opera. He took a certain pleasure when someone asked him whether he had gone to the premiere of Debussy's Pelléas et Mélisande, in saying, "No, I was too busy rehearsing Götterdämmerung." This was the first stage performance of the opera in France, and it was a financial disaster. Cortot, who had underwritten the costs, was left owing 350,000 francs. With honest stubbornness, he refused to be declared bankrupt, and so, at the age of 25, he set about paying off the debt by playing the piano. This was the beginning of the regime that would take him to a total of over 6,000 recitals, on average 2 a week, every week, for the next 60 years. In 1905, 3 years after conducting Götterdämmerung, he formed the famous trio with Pablo Casals and Jacques Thibault as a further means of making money. Over 20 years later, they made their recordings of Haydn, Beethoven and Schubert trios, and the recording manager for many of these was Jean Bérard.
On y voit là, chez Casals, la sécurité, en même temps qu'une certaine rudesse et en phrase sur lequel il n'y a pas besoin de revenir. C'était le premier violoncelliste de son temps.
Casals represented a sense of security, along with a certain ruggedness and, of course, incomparable phrasing. He was the outstanding cellist of his day. But when Cortot took up the same phrase, he was one step closer to fantasy, a little less controlled, a little more subtle, and always that wonderful tone. And then Thibault. Well, Thibault represented pure inspiration. There was a very personal, floating quality to his playing. The contrast in their 3 styles was quite remarkable.
Aérien qui lui appartenait en propre. L'opposition des 3 jeux est quelque chose de remarquable.
The stylistic discrepancies showed up even more sharply when Cortot accompanied Casals or Thibault in duet sonatas. One can only say that there was understanding on some deeper level than the one we loosely call style. Compromise was a word not in Cortot's vocabulary, and his single-minded pursuit of his own aims made him numerous enemies. 2 of the most ferocious of these were his fellow pianists, Isidore Philippe and Marguerite Long. Gaby Casadsu remembers when the time came for her to leave Madame Long's class and go back to Cortot, who had originally received her into the Paris Conservatoire.
When I finished Madame Long's class, elementary classes, she said, "I have to send you back to Cortot because it is Cortot who sends you to me. He is no more my friend, but he has been the one who sent you to me, I have to send you back to him." So I don't know what happened between, but I suppose some pianist jealousy or something.
And to complete the happy picture, Isidore Philippe, when he was finally settled in America after the Second World War, used to look first in the obituary column of his morning paper, hoping to see that either Cortot or Madame Long was dead, and preferably both. Cortot took over the senior class for girls at the Conservatoire in 1907, and taught there until 1919. He was not content just to go through the motions, as many of his colleagues did, and he was not content either with some of the little habits he found. He referred somewhat waspishly in his writings to what he called conservatoire climaxes. I asked Madame Taliaferro what he meant by this.
Well, I suppose he wanted to say at that moment the habit in the conservatoire was to do crescendis, but never until the end. They stopped just before the top. Then it was very bad, and he hated that.
And certainly when Cortot came to a climax, there was no drop in the intensity. Well, there were mistakes, but for me that playing is unmistakably corto, in the way that he first of all generates tension all the way up to the climax, and then, as it were, travels on accumulated energy from there on. Another example of the architectural grasp of his playing that Angus Morrison referred to earlier. Corto regarded his teaching as being just as important as his playing, perhaps even more so. His outlook was very far from being purely technical.
It was a Weber evening. It was a romantic period we were covering, with Weber, Mendelssohn, Schubert, Chopin, Liszt, and Schumann. But this is Weber, and I'd been allowed to play, I should say, the Invitation to the Danse Lamentation, the Tausig arrangement. So we had the sonata, and then we had the Concertstück, which he played. He played the orchestral part on the other piano, which was interesting, as I turned the pages and I heard all this wonderful orchestral colouring. So this even made me more nervous before I played the Lamentation. So he said, "Do you like to dance?" I said, "Yes, I love dance." He said, "Well, why don't you sound as if you do?" I thought, oh, this is going to be good. He's not going to say, now you practice the octaves and you have to change the fingering and that thumb goes under such sound. And this isn't a packed hall, of course. The audience were loving every minute because I think I was a very good feed for him or something. But it was interesting because I'd been playing the middle of the Lamentation, you know, sort of delicately, nicely, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And he said, it is the... And off we went into the marvellous... And I think if I'd never learned anything else in that period, I learned how to play a Viennese waltz. And of course it's been very useful in Rosenkavalier, the Royal Opera.
And there were times when his passion for the music broke through the surface of French politeness.
He used to get very furious about Schumann, of all things. No one could please him in playing Schumann. And we had two very difficult Schumann evenings. One when we had two American pianists playing the Carnival very loudly. Probably they were very nervous, I should think. And one poor boy, he got halfway through and Corto stopped him, closed the piano, closed the music, lid, even the lid of the piano came down. And he said, that is a parody of the music. It's no good. You never exaggerate in Schumann. It's very difficult. You have to find the truth of Schumann. And then walked round the piano. This was 9:15 in the evening. We're supposed to finish at 1 in the morning. Patting the piano, saying, poor piano, poor piano. And stroking it. And walked off. I remember a boy playing the A-flat ballad of Chopin. He said, do you know what this means? And he played it just wonderfully well. And he said, this is a love affair. And you make it sound like a marriage of convenience.
I asked Vlado Perlmutter about the repertoire he studied with Corto.
Well, we played not only romantic. I must say I didn't play Mozart with him, neither Mozart or no Bach. But we played Beethoven a lot. And of course, Mendelssohn, he loved Mendelssohn. Certain pieces of Mendelssohn, like Variations Sérieuses, you see, I practiced with him at the class. But he loved to teach Beethoven. And he loved Weber, for instance, too. But of course, what I practiced the most with him was Chopin. He was a great master in Chopin.
A variety of Chopin traditions spread through pupils and friends all over Europe by the end of the 19th century. Corto, as a pupil of a pupil, felt strongly that he enjoyed thereby a privileged form of communication with the master. His later publicity material often included a photograph of himself at the age of 38, strikingly similar to Nadar's famous daguerreotype of Chopin at exactly the same age. The long nose, the haunting eyes, the pursed mouth, the hair worn long over the ears. Whether the pose was deliberately cultivated, I couldn't say, though I suspect it was. At all events, it can only have fed what Corto called that fruitful illusion which leads the interpreter to believe himself, for a moment, the composer of the work. Oh, dangerous illusion. And then there was the matter of the make of piano that Cortot preferred. Nina Walker again.
He was giving a lesson on the tarantelle one day, and it was a day when I should have done the B-flat minor scherzo, and of course I got myself in a terrible state all day again, practicing like mad, trying to keep calm. And it was 12:15 in the morning, and he'd had a long evening, so he said, I can't hear your scherzo now, but you come up to the house tomorrow. And of course this was marvellous, because I went up to this beautiful house over the hills, overlooking Lausanne, and walked into the music room expecting to see the most beautiful Steinway. And there was the oldest player I think I've ever seen in my life. So I said, well, is that the piano? He said, yes, Mademoiselle Walker, you play that. If you can make a sound on that, you are a pianist. Of course, I tried to play it, you know, and no sound was coming out at all, nothing. So I was getting rather fed up with this. He said, get off the, I show you. Sat at the piano, and out came the most wonderful sounds. He said, a pianist never blames the instrument. It is you, not the instrument.
To be fair, Cortot's choice of a Pleyel does have a more prosaic explanation. When he won his first prize at the Conservatoire, part of the award was a new grand piano, either an Erard or a Pleyel, and the Erard was too big to go into his parents' tiny flat. In 1914, Cortot was made a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, and, though not yet 40, he had become one of the most respected and influential musicians in France. He was increasingly in demand all over the continent and in the United States, and he was finding it difficult to fit these engagements in with his teaching. His solution to this problem was characteristic. He left the Conservatoire and founded his own institution, the École Normale de Musique. This meant that not only could he take leave when he wanted to, he could also set up a more realistic course for aspiring pianists.
Cortot veillait à ce que les élèves puissent donner un concert où il n'y avait pas éternellement la sonate en si mineur, le Liszt ou la quatrième ballade de Chopin.
Cortot made sure his pupils could command a much wider repertoire than war horses like the Liszt B minor sonata or Chopin's Fourth Ballade. In the master classes he gave at the end of the year, the pupils played in public, and Cortot showed them the appropriate interpretation, corrected theirs, and himself played the piano as well. It was fascinating.
Il leur montrait l'interprétation qui convenait, corrigeait, se mettait lui-même au clavier, et c'était là d'un très grand intérêt.
Cortot was in fact the inventor of the master class. Much of the money to run the École Normale de Musique came from rich Americans. Mr. Walter Scott of New York set up scholarships to send American pianists to the Normal School of Music. And other scholarships followed, allowing participants 2 months in Paris to perfect their musical training under the world's greatest masters, such as Alfred Cortot, Jacques Thibault, Georges Enesco, Pablo Casals, Marcel Dupré. Students were largely enticed by Cortot's masterclasses, which took place in May and June. And here we come up against a whole set of paradoxes involving Cortot the teacher and Cortot the creative artist. The masterclasses, as I've said, were a huge success. Those who attended them still remember the atmosphere of almost mystical exaltation in which they were conducted. But it's undeniable that Cortot's best pupils all came from the time before 1920, when he was teaching at the Conservatoire. The only first-rate pianist to emerge from the École Normale was Lipaki, and his playing was formed before he went there. Why the École Normale failed in this respect, I really can't explain. Another paradox concerns repertoire. Mr. Perlmutter indicates that Cortot's interests went further than is generally assumed.
What will perhaps be interesting for you, that later on he was very interested by contemporary music. Yes, he was very interested. Well, when I met him, he said, why don't you play the Prokofiev concerto? You want to play. At that time, you see, it was not contemporary music, but it was very modern music. And I played the third Prokofiev concerto on the advice of Cortot. That's a part of Cortot that the people don't know. And what is very interesting, when he was older, he was very interested by the Viennese school, Schoenberg and Berg and Weber. He didn't play any of these work, but he was very interested. He knew. Well, he was a sort of a universal man. He was interested by everything.
But this universal man himself had a definitely restricted repertoire. With very few exceptions, it began in 1800 and ended in 1914. Certainly within that period it was encyclopedic, ranging from Albéniz to Weber, from Saint-Saëns to Scriabin. But he never played Prokofiev or Bartók or Schoenberg or Poulenc or Stravinsky. One of the most instructive things about him was his attitude to the music of Ravel. Ravel, after all, had been a fellow student of his. I asked Madame Cassade-Su whether she thought Cortot understood Ravel's music.
He did something that we did not like so much, the fact that he said the concerto for the left hand is so difficult that he has to be done with two hands, and he made his transcription of it. But my husband did not like at all the fact to change after all. You know, the whole thing is built by the part of the piano there, and it's so interesting. And it gives a different feeling if you play with two hands.
Madame Cassade-Su's husband wasn't the only one who disapproved. When the news of what was afoot reached Ravel, he rushed round to the publishers to forbid any such thing, and there was talk of a lawsuit. A year or so after Ravel's death, Cortot recorded the concerto, and the technical quality of his performance leaves no doubt that he was attempting it with one hand only, a recording that is better off gathering dust in the archives. But in any case, in his earlier recording of Jeu d'eau, full of rubato, Cortot shows that Ravel's classicism and deliberately mechanistic style were quite foreign to his nature. The French composer he did understand was Debussy, because both Debussy and Cortot were concerned to evoke images and to create atmosphere. And when Cortot speaks of defective phrasing too exactly hemmed in by that concern for the bar line which hinders pianists from getting the full flavour out of a melody, then he is talking not in Ravelian, but in Debussyan terms. His playing of Debussy draws much of its character simply from his extraordinary tone. One of his pupils remembers how one day a girl was playing Danseuse de Delphes, the first of the Debussy preludes. It was all rather dull and colourless, and Cortot interrupted her. "No," he said, "like this." And standing behind her, he leant over her shoulders and played the opening phrase with a perfect legato and an immediate tonal atmosphere. But, as Nina Walker has said, when it came to these ultimate secrets of his playing, he was unable to pass them on. Or was he unwilling to? It's not unknown for performers to guard what is, after all, their livelihood. Again, I don't see we can ever decide this one way or the other. All his pupils that I talked to agreed that he hardly discussed technical detail. But it's important, I think, to nail the canard that Cortot himself had a poor technique, and for that reason didn't bother with it in his teaching. technique. I wish I had some of it. Cocteau set great store by reducing a taxing passage in, say, a Chopin study to its constituent difficulties, and then inventing exercises for each difficulty in turn. He was one of the first teachers to point out that merely playing and replaying the Chopin study itself probably reinforced the bad habit that was causing the trouble. He left his legacy of this approach in his working editions of Chopin.
I think at the end of his life, being more or less unable to come back to France, staying in Switzerland, I think he wrote all this explanation about the way to practice etude and all that, which is very interesting. I don't know if he did it with the help of someone, but I think it is very interesting anyway. So it's so strange because it's absolutely different of what I earned from him when he was 45 or something, or 50 years old.
One day he told me, when I said, but in your fourth ballad of Chopin, you write that thing, I don't remember what. And he said, oh, if you believe what is in the paper, then it is impossible.
Another paradox. Added to which, Vlado Perlmutter said to me that if you really went through the working editions of the 24 studies getting everything perfect, you'd need 6 months on each. This tension between the disciplined and the intuitive artist ran right through Cocteau's life. It was almost as though the tremendous force of his intuition had to be balanced by discipline for the sake of his psychological health. His private life was for years unhappy. His first wife, who had been married to Romain Rolland, was more an intellectual than a homemaker, and after the early deaths of both their children, they relapsed into a mariage blanc. In the early 1930s, Cocteau shocked French society by leaving her for Renée Chêne, who was to become his second wife. Cocteau, typically, was unmoved by bourgeois disapproval. He needed emotional support, though he would probably have denied it. Running the École Normale, teaching, writing, collecting manuscripts and objets d'art, recording, not to mention the 6,000 concerts, all this demanded the most rigorous organization of his time. He was up at 6, winter and summer. 6:45, breakfast. 7 o'clock, correspondence. All was dealt with on the same day and always handwritten, and on average he wrote 20 letters a day. Then 4 hours practice until lunch. Coffee was served at the table, and Cocteau allowed himself to take life easily for an hour. 2 o'clock, no siesta, but cataloguing of papers and writing memos to himself on his previous concert. Must practice that passage before next time. I played dreadfully, but the conductor was worse. 3 o'clock, he was driven to the École Normale. Walking wasted valuable time. Work in his office till 6, then home, or to play a concert. And Cocteau's concerts gave an audience their money's worth. I quote at random a concert of 1935. Chopin, the B minor sonata, the Fantaisie, the Barcarolle, the C-sharp minor waltz, the second scherzo, the berceuse, the A-flat polonaise, and then the whole of Debussy's second book of preludes. It may seem strange that the same man should live by such a rigid discipline, but make so many mistakes in his playing. I asked Madame Taliaferro why she thought this happened.
Many reasons for that. Cocteau had a greatest technique than the people said. But he was a very busy man as far as the music is concerned. He was a very good conductor, and I can testify that never have I been so well conducted than when I played with Cocteau the first concerto of Beethoven in the Salle Pleyel in Paris. He founded the École Normale of Music, which always exists, and was the head of the school. And on the top of all, he was practicing his piano as much as possible. You can understand it's very difficult to be perfect in that case. And he was and enjoyed a very deep technique. He had not enough time to practice, and he ought to have.
So maybe the universal man paid this penalty for his enormous gifts. Another reason I've heard suggested is a technical one, that he didn't move his elbows freely, but kept them tucked into his sides, so that when his hands had to play at the extremities of the piano, they were at an angle to the keyboard. Certainly this is borne out to some extent in his recordings. Slips do tend to occur at the top and bottom rather than in the middle. Madame Casadsu offered another explanation.
In America, they said it was difficult for him because the fact that he was not perfect, in one way. But by the fact of his sometimes losing exactly the melody or something.
He liked to take risks, do you think?
Yes, but I think also maybe because he never did any harmony, you see. He never learned anything about harmony of a piece. I don't think so. He was not in any class of harmony or composition, because I think that's helped a lot for the memory.
This is not, of course, to say that a musician of Coulter's caliber couldn't have picked up a knowledge of harmony as he went along. Perhaps the most interesting explanation I got came from Jean Bérard.
Ce qui caractérise Cortot sont ses doigtés.
One characteristic of Cortot is his fingering. If you compare Paderewski's edition of Chopin to Cortot's, for example, you find that where Paderewski's fingering has safety in mind, Cortot's fingering aims first at sensitivity and expression.
Paderewski, par exemple, a un doigté de sécurité, et Cortot a un doigté de sensibilité et d'expression.
And if you look at Coulter's working editions, you see on every page examples of what Monsieur Bérard so nicely calls a doigté de sensibilité. An important note has to be played with a strong finger, and if this means making a leap difficult, then so be it. In Coulter's scale of values, to achieve a feeble accuracy was to fall far short of doing the composer justice. The phrasing was the all-important thing. Then, of course, there's always the most obvious explanation. Was Coulter nervous before a performance?
Oh, terribly nervous before the concerts. When he was on the stage in front of his piano, naturally he was inspired. But before the concerts, he was in a terrible, nervous, he passed terrible moments. And one day I remember when I came back from Spanish, I knew he played in Poitiers, and I stopped there to hear him. And I arrived in the hall of the concerts, and immediately I went to go to see him and to tell him that I was there. And the piano tuner told me, "Oh, please don't do that, because he's so nervous, he didn't want to enter the stage."
As Madame Taliaferro so wisely said earlier on, it is difficult to be perfect. Coulter's contribution to the artistic glory of France was duly recognized by the French government. From being a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor in 1914, he was promoted to Officier in 1924 and to Commandeur in 1934. 1944 should have seen him a Grand Officier, but it was not to be. Coulter's behavior during the Second World War has been the subject of much speculation. It is a fact that during it he gave concerts in Germany. It is a fact that in occupied France in 1941 he rose to a position of power in the Ministry of Education. These two facts have in many cases been enough to condemn him, even among his pupils. Clara Haskell never spoke to him again, and Igor Markovich, though he eventually forgave, cannot forget or really understand his actions. But it should also be recorded that the condition on which Cortot gave those recitals in Germany was that he should also be allowed to play for French prisoners of war in the German prison camps, a condition which the German publicity machine, of course, kept to itself. And one could well argue that if Cortot hadn't helped direct musical life under the Nazis, somebody else would have. At least part of the trouble was that Cortot saw his chance to bring what he saw as much-needed discipline to the musical organization of his country. He didn't think it was right that any old lady could set herself up as a piano teacher, without a diploma or qualification of any sort. So he set up a committee to correct these abuses, and the members were among the most prominent of French musicians: Charles Munch, Thibaut, Bernac, Poulenc, Messiaen, even Marguerite Long. Cortot's decisiveness, or as some would say, his aggressive self-righteousness, made him still more enemies. A headline in the newspaper Paris Midi in November 1943 tells its own story. Alfred Cortot explains what has to be done and what has already been done to turn the French into musicians. The final results of all this were predictably unpleasant. At the end of the war, Cortot was briefly imprisoned, and then banned from playing in public for a year, in the rather unlikely company of Maurice Chevalier, Sacha Guitry, and Mr. Gued. He returned to the platform in April 1946, but the following January, when he was engaged to play the Schumann Concerto at the Conservatoire concerts, the orchestra walked off as he walked on. He sued them and eventually won. But he'd had enough of Paris, and he spent the last 15 years of his life in Lausanne. His concert engagements rose to a peak of 135 appearances in 1952, the year of his 75th birthday. And he continued to record and to teach. As we've heard, it was in Lausanne that Nina Walker went to study with him.
I think more than anything with Cortot, I remember his pianissimo, because it was like a great actor with a stage whisper. I had never, in my life, heard a pianist with such a pianissimo. And of course then the fortissimo was enormous by comparison, and he always stayed in quality and never went into quantity. And he almost learnt the notes so that he could forget them. He could get into the music. He went way past anything I'd ever imagined. I wasn't conscious of the man. I wasn't conscious of the piano. I was terribly conscious of the music.
And was that something that he tried to get you to do, to work from inside yourself?
Yes. Yes, he wanted you not to... He couldn't bear anybody hitting the keyboard for the sake of hitting it, or working on ego, or... He tried to make you become one with the music, and to get rid of self, in a way. I think I will never forget his playing of the Berceuse, the Chopin Berceuse, which was like, it was the quietest playing I've ever heard in my life, and yet the most resonant.
Cortot's whole musical life can be seen as a crusade against mediocrity, against laziness, against routine, against pianists who banged or were hemmed in by bar lines. Of course, such a man made enemies. Men of principle always do. His war record, for instance, can be interpreted as showing a too rigorous regard for principle. the principle that music is more important than politics. We may see this attitude as naive, but then Cort's naivety was one of the most important things about him. It's been said that he never outgrew his native peasant mentality. He set his plough to the furrow and would get to the end, come what may, without looking to right or left. Only a naive man, out of touch with the times, could still in the 1950s be giving titles to Chopin's preludes. The beloved waits anxiously. In the distance, the empty sea. And for the one in F-sharp minor, the snow falls, the wind howls, the tempest rages, but in my desolate heart the storm is yet more terrible. It sounds better in French, but even so. Only a naive man and an honest one could give himself so totally to what lay behind the notes.
Il avait choisi une technique qui lui permettait de trouver la sensibilité, l'expression et d'arriver à des émotions sonores extraordinaires, ce qui ne l'empêchait pas d'avoir une technique excellente.
His chosen technique was geared primarily towards expression and to the creation of extraordinary emotions through sound. That didn't stop his technique being both brilliant and safe, but it did mean that in his recordings there are occasional uncertainties. He and I didn't always use takes that were necessarily the most rigorously accurate, sometimes preferring takes which, even with slips, displayed a greater sensitivity. They corresponded more closely to his interpretation of the work in question.
Représentait des moments les meilleurs et une sensibilité plus grande et une interprétation plus juste à son goût de l'œuvre.
Cortot gave his last concert with Pablo Casals on the 10th of July 1958 in Prague. They played Beethoven, the A major sonata, and then the variations on a theme from the Magic Flute. The applause was endless. Backstage, Cortot made one of his typical remarks, which might or might not have been meant seriously. We ought to have played all 5 Beethoven sonatas. Pablo goes round playing them with any old pianist. That's to say, Rudolf Serkin, Wilhelm Kempff. Cortot never mentioned other pianists. He walked his own tightrope far above the admiring crowd, balancing discipline against intuition, history against personal feeling, notes against the music behind them. In the words of his friend and biographer Bernard Gavotti, Cortot was without a trace of vanity. He was the personification of pride.
I think he was more relaxed before an audience with students, teaching, discussing. Probably heard some of his greatest playing at moments like this, rather than before an audience, which I don't think any true artist, a great artist, really likes to perform before an audience. I think they feel that there's an intrusion on the privacy of their own mind and what they want.
Cortot, who was a wonderful player, often was more ineptly than one can forgive him, though it was so inspired at other times. But I think in those days, certain pianists' accuracy was a hazard of playing. To a certain extent, I think the gramophone and wireless has made people much more conscious of accuracy as being very important. But there were so many other compensating qualities in his playing.
I think the real word is he was magic. He was fascinating. And he had an imagination, musical imagination, extraordinary, you know. And the color of his tune was superb. You were really fascinated by him.
He was playing with a lot of fire, and always, for example, when he was playing the Chopin sonata, he was doing beautiful chords. No, I think he had a beautiful singing tone.
And where did this tone come from?
I suppose it was coming from his heart.
With Alfred Cortot himself playing The Poet Speaks from Schumann's Kinderszenen, we end The Poet of the Piano, a portrait of Cortot written and presented by Roger Nichols, with the help of reminiscences and reflections from some of Cortot's colleagues and pupils. Jean Bérard, Gaby Casadessus, Arthur Auéré, Angus Morrison, Vlado Perlmutter, Magda Taliaferro, and Nina Walker. The Poet of the Piano was produced by Piers Burton Page.